All 4 of my children promised they would take care of me, but for 15 days not one of them showed up. I remember sitting in my living room that first night, still holding on to those words like they meant something, like promises from your own children couldn't just disappear overnight. The house felt different after that conversation, quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful, just hollow, like the walls were waiting for something that never came. At 68, I had started to accept that I needed help with certain things, nothing dramatic, just small things like picking up groceries, driving me to appointments, making sure I didn't forget my medication. When Daniel suggested we all sit down and make a plan, I thought it came from love. I thought maybe I did something right raising them. We had dinner together that night, all 4 of them around the table, talking over each other the way they used to when they were kids. Rebecca said she could stop by every Monday. Lucas said weekends worked better for him. Emily smiled and squeezed my hand, promising she'd check in every few days. Just to make sure you're okay, Mom. Even Daniel, always so busy, said he'd handle anything urgent. I remember looking at them, really looking, and feeling something warm settle in my chest. I wasn't alone. Not really. That's what I believed. The next morning, I woke up expecting to hear something, my phone ringing, a message, maybe even a knock at the door. But there was nothing. I told myself it was too soon. People have lives, jobs, responsibilities. So I made my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited a little longer. By the 3rd day, I started checking my phone more often. Not obsessively, just every hour or so, like maybe I'd missed something. A text. A voicemail. Anything. But the screen stayed blank. The house stayed quiet. I began stretching out my groceries, making things last longer than they should. A single carton of milk. Half a loaf of bread. I wasn't worried yet. Just adjusting. That's what I told myself. By day 7, the silence had weight. It pressed against me in the mornings when I opened my eyes and realized no one was coming. It followed me. Into the kitchen, into the hallway, into the bedroom where I used to feel safe. I picked up the phone once, stared at Daniel's name, and then set it back down. If they meant what they said, they would call. They would come. I didn't want to beg for something that was already promised. On the 10th day, I noticed how still everything had become. Even the clock on the wall sounded louder, each tick stretching out longer than it should. I sat in my chair by the window and watched the street, cars passing by, people going about their lives. Normal life. It felt like I was watching it from behind glass, separated somehow, like I had quietly slipped out of the world without anyone noticing. I thought about that dinner again, the way they laughed, the way they spoke so easily about taking care of me, as if it was already decided, already done. I replayed every word in my head, searching for something I missed, some hesitation, some sign that those promises weren't real. But there was nothing. Just warmth that didn't last. By the 15th day, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. It wasn't that they forgot. It wasn't that they were busy. It was simpler than that. They just didn't come. I stood in the middle of my living room that morning, the same room where we had made those plans, and I realized how quiet it had become, how completely still. No footsteps. No voices. No sign that I belonged to anyone anymore. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. I did not rush into anything after that moment, and that was the first change I noticed in myself, because for most of my life I had been quick to respond, quick to fix things, quick to make sure everyone else was comfortable before I ever thought about myself. This time, I let the silence stay exactly where it was. I made another cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, not out of habit, but with intention. The clock on the wall read 9:15 in the morning, and I decided I would start paying attention to time again, not as something to endure, but as something I could control. I opened the small drawer beside the refrigerator and took out a folder I had not touched in years. It held old documents, bank statements, property papers, things I used to organize carefully when my husband was still alive. Back then, we handled everything together. After he passed, I kept everything in order, just in case the children ever needed to step in. I used to believe that one day they would. I placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly, flipping through each page with steady hands. Numbers. Dates. Signatures. Everything that represented a lifetime of work, of saving, of building something stable for the future. I noticed how neat everything was, how carefully I had prepared for a time when I might not be able to manage things on my own. And yet, when that time came, no one showed up. I closed the folder halfway and leaned back in my chair, letting that thought settle in fully. It was not that I could not manage. It was that I had been waiting for help that was never going to come. That realization did not hurt the way it might have before. It clarified things. I stood up and walked into the bedroom, opening the closet where I kept a small safe on the top shelf. I reached up slowly, brought it down, and placed it on the bed. The metal felt cold under my fingers as I entered the code. Inside were documents I had not looked at in a long time. Insurance policies. The deed to the house. Copies of everything important. I sat on the edge of the bed and began going through them one by one, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet focus I had not felt in years. For the first time, I was not thinking about leaving these things for my children. I was thinking about what they actually meant to me. What they represented. My time. My effort. My life. I set a few papers aside and placed the rest back into the safe, closing it with a soft click. The sound echoed slightly in the room, more final than I expected. When I returned to the living room, I noticed something else had changed. The house did not feel as empty as it had before. Not because anything had filled it, but because I was no longer waiting for it to be filled by someone else. I walked over to the phone and picked it up, scrolling through my contacts. Their names were still there, exactly where they had always been. Daniel. Rebecca. Lucas. Emily. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, then moved past each one without stopping. Instead, I selected a different name. A number I had saved years ago and never thought I would need to use. I listened as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When the voice on the other end answered calm and professional, I felt no hesitation. I introduced myself clearly, explaining that I needed to schedule an appointment. Not for an emergency. Not out of fear. But because it was time to make decisions that should have been mine all along. As I hung up the phone, I placed it back on the table with steady hands. The air in the room felt different now, not lighter, but sharper, like everything had come into focus. I looked around at the same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet that had surrounded me for 15 days, and I understood something I had not understood before. Nothing about this house had changed. The only thing that had changed was me. The next morning, I woke up before the sun had fully risen, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind no longer allowed me to sleep through the quiet the way it used to. There was a clarity now, a steady awareness that followed me from the moment I opened my eyes. I sat up slowly and looked around the room, taking in the familiar shapes and shadows that had once felt comforting but now simply existed without meaning. For years I had filled this house with purpose, with routines that made every corner feel alive. Now, I was beginning to see it differently, not as a place waiting for people, but as a place that had been carrying more history than I had ever stopped to notice. I walked into the kitchen and made breakfast, something simple, just toast and eggs, but I set the table properly anyway. Plate. Glass. Napkin. I did not rush through it. I did not eat standing up. I sat down and took my time, something I had not done in years. There was no one to interrupt me, no one asking for anything, no one rushing me through the moment. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Then, it felt deliberate. After breakfast, I went to the hallway again, stopping in front of the same row of photographs. This time, I did not just glance at them. I studied them. In one picture, Daniel was holding a baseball trophy, his smile wide and proud, his arm wrapped tightly around me as if letting go was not even a thought. In another, Rebecca stood in her graduation gown, her head leaning gently against my shoulder. Lucas, younger, laughing in a backyard filled with summer light. Emily, the youngest, holding my hand with both of hers as if I was the center of her entire world. I stood there longer than I expected, not lost in the past, but observing it, almost like I was seeing it for the first time without emotion clouding the details. Back then, everything I did revolved around them. Their schedules. Their needs. Their futures. I built my life around making sure they never felt alone, never felt unsupported, never had to question whether someone would show up for them. I remembered nights when I stayed awake waiting for them to come home safely, mornings when I woke up early to prepare meals before school, weekends spent driving from one activity to another without a second thought. It was never a burden. It was simply what I believed being a mother meant. I gave without measuring. I showed up without being asked. I kept everything running without expecting anything in return. That was the life I chose, and for a long time, I never questioned it. But standing there now, something shifted in the way I understood those memories. It was not regret. It was recognition. I began to see the pattern I had missed for years, the way I had made it easy for them to take my presence for granted. I had always been there, so they never had to think about what it meant to lose that. I stepped back from the wall and let my hand fall to my side. The photographs stayed where they were, unchanged, but the meaning behind them had started to settle differently in my mind. I was not the same woman who had taken those pictures. That version of me believed that love alone was enough to keep people close. Now I understood that love, without boundaries, can slowly erase the person who gives it. I walked into the living room and picked up the folder I had left on the table the day before. This time, I did not hesitate. I sat down, opened it again, and began sorting through everything with a clear sense of direction. I made small piles, separating what mattered from what did not, organizing not for them, but for myself. Every document I touched felt like a piece of my own life I was finally taking responsibility for in a different way. Not as something to pass down, but as something to protect. When I finished, I closed the folder and placed it neatly beside me. The house was still quiet. The clock still ticked steadily on the wall. Nothing outside had changed. But inside, something had settled into place. I was no longer looking at what I had lost. I was beginning to understand what I still had control over. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday morning, and for the first time in a long while, I had something marked on my calendar that belonged entirely to me. I wrote it down carefully in blue ink, underlining the time as if to remind myself that this was not something to overlook or postpone. The days leading up to it passed quietly, but not in the same way as before. The silence no longer felt like something pressing down on me. It felt like space. Space to think, to notice, to finally see what had been in front of me all along. On the second evening after I made the call, my phone lit up for the first time in over 2 weeks. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring once, twice, before I slowly picked it up and looked at the screen. Rebecca. Her name sat there as if nothing had changed, as if 15 days of absence could be erased with a single call. I answered without rushing. Her voice came through light and casual, almost cheerful, asking how I was doing, as if she expected the answer to be simple. I listened to her for a moment before responding, keeping my tone steady, telling her I was fine. I did not mention the days. I did not ask why she had not come. I let the silence between my words carry what I chose not to say. She filled that silence quickly, explaining how busy things had been, how work had been overwhelming, how time had just slipped away. The words sounded familiar, practiced even, like something she had said many times before in different situations. I did not challenge her. I did not agree either. I simply listened. After a few minutes, she asked if I needed anything. The question hung there for a second, waiting for me to step back into the role I had always played. The one who asked for little, who made it easy for everyone else. I paused, then told her no. There was a brief hesitation on her end, almost as if she had expected something else, something more. Then she said she would try to visit soon. I thanked her and ended the call. I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a moment, noticing how different that interaction felt. There was no relief. No sense of comfort. Just clarity. The next day, Daniel sent a message. Short. Direct. Asking if everything was okay. I read it once, then set the phone aside without responding right away. For years, I had answered immediately, always available, always ready. This time, I waited. Not out of spite, but because I no longer felt the urgency to prove that I was still there. When I finally replied hours later, I kept it simple. Yes. Everything is fine. No explanation. No invitation. Just the truth as I understood it now. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. A message from Lucas. A missed call from Emily. Small gestures, scattered and inconsistent, like they were remembering me in pieces rather than as a whole. I observed it without reacting, without stepping in to fill the gaps the way I used to. It became clear that their attention came in moments, not in commitment. And for the first time, I was not trying to turn those moments into something they were not. Thursday arrived quietly. I got ready with the same care I used to reserve for family gatherings, choosing a simple outfit, brushing my hair slowly, looking at myself in the mirror with a steady gaze. I did not see the same woman who had waited by the door 15 days earlier. There was something different in the way I stood, in the way I carried myself. Not stronger in an obvious way, but more certain. More grounded. I picked up my bag, checked that I had everything I needed, and paused briefly at the front door. For years, leaving this house had always been about coming back to it, to the people inside it. This time, as I stepped outside, I realized I was not leaving anything behind. I was moving towards something that belonged to me. The drive to the office was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one inside my house. This one felt steady, almost grounding, like each mile I passed was taking me further away from something I had outgrown without realizing it. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, my posture straight, my eyes focused ahead. I did not turn on the radio. I did not fill the space with noise. I let my thoughts move clearly, without interruption. When I pulled into the parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment before getting out, looking at the building in front of me. It was plain, professional, nothing remarkable about it. But to me, it represented something I had not allowed myself to fully step into before. Control. I stepped out of the car, closed the door gently, and walked toward the entrance with measured steps. Inside, the air was cool, the lighting soft but precise, everything arranged in a way that felt intentional. A receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, asked for my name, and directed me to a chair while I waited. I sat down, placing my bag neatly beside me, and folded my hands in my lap. There were other people in the room, flipping through magazines, checking their phones, existing in their own separate worlds. I noticed how no one here knew me, and for once, that felt like freedom instead of loneliness. When my name was called, I stood up without hesitation and followed the woman down a quiet hallway into a small office. The man who greeted me introduced himself calmly, his tone professional but not distant. He gestured for me to sit, and I did. For a moment, he waited, giving me space to begin. I appreciated that. I had spent years speaking only when needed, explaining only what others asked for. This time, I chose my words carefully. I told him I wanted to review everything. Not because something had gone wrong legally, but because something had become clear personally. I explained that I had 4 children, that I had spent my life building something stable for them, something they could rely on. I did not speak with bitterness. I spoke with precision. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, taking notes. When I finished, he asked a few questions. Direct. Thoughtful. Not invasive, just enough to understand what I wanted. And for the first time, I answered without hesitation, without second-guessing whether my decisions would affect anyone else. Because this time, that was not the point. We went through documents together, page by page, discussing options I had never seriously considered before. Adjustments. Transfers. Protections. Each word felt like a step I should have taken years ago, but had always postponed, believing there would be time, believing there would be someone to share the responsibility with. But sitting there, I realized I did not need to wait for anyone to stand beside me in order to make decisions for my own life. When he explained the final steps, the process of making everything official, I listened carefully and nodded. There was no fear in me. No doubt. Only a quiet certainty that settled deeper with every word. When the meeting ended, I stood up, shook his hand, and thanked him. My voice was steady, my expression calm. As I walked back through the hallway and into the waiting area, nothing felt overwhelming. Nothing felt rushed. Everything felt exactly as it should be. Outside, the air was warmer than I expected, the sunlight stronger now, casting clear shadows across the pavement. I walked back to my car, unlocked the door, and sat down behind the wheel again. This time, I did not pause. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. As the road stretched out in front of me, I realized something that had been quietly building since the moment I stopped waiting. I was no longer reacting to what my children had done. I was deciding what they would no longer have the power to do. When I returned home that afternoon, the house greeted me the same way it always had, quiet and still, but this time it did not feel like something I needed to endure. It felt like something I understood. I set my keys down on the small table by the door and walked slowly into the living room, taking in every detail without rushing past it. The chair by the window. The clock on the wall. The folder still resting where I had left it. Everything was exactly where it had been, but I was not. I moved with intention now, each step deliberate, each action connected to a decision I had already made. I sat down and opened the folder again, not because I needed to review anything, but because I wanted to see it one more time through this new perspective. These papers no longer represented something I was holding onto for my children. They represented boundaries I was finally putting into place for myself. My phone buzzed again on the table beside me. This time it was Lucas. I glanced at the screen but did not pick it up right away. I let it ring, the sound filling the room briefly before fading into silence again. A message followed almost immediately. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Been meaning to call." I read it once, then placed the phone face down on the table. The words did not carry the weight they once would have. They were not unkind. They were not cruel. But they were not enough. Not after 15 days of absence that had said more than any message ever could. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. There was no anger rising in me, no need to respond immediately, no urgency to repair anything. That need had disappeared somewhere between the silence and the realization that followed it. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, filling a glass of water and setting it down carefully on the counter. Simple actions felt different now. They were no longer done out of routine or obligation. They were done because I chose to do them. Later that evening, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It caught my attention not because I had been expecting anyone, but because it had become unfamiliar. I walked to the window and looked out, noticing Daniel stepping out of his car, adjusting his jacket as he looked toward the house. For a brief moment, I stood there watching him, not rushing to the door, not calling out his name. Just observing. He walked up the path and knocked, the sound firm but not urgent. I waited a few seconds before opening the door, meeting his eyes with a calm expression. He smiled, a little uncertain, as if trying to read something in my face that he could not quite find. "Mom," he said, stepping inside as if the space still belonged to him the way it always had. He glanced around quickly, taking in the room, the quiet, the absence of anything that demanded his attention. "I have been busy," he added, almost immediately, as if the explanation needed to come before anything else. I nodded once, not questioning it, not inviting him to elaborate. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us not measured in feet, but in everything that had gone unsaid over the past 2 weeks. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. My voice was steady, my tone even, giving nothing more than what was asked. He shifted slightly, his posture uncertain now, as if he had expected something different. A complaint. A story. A reason to step back into a familiar role. But there was nothing like that waiting for him. Instead, there was silence. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present. He walked further into the living room, glancing at the table where the folders sat neatly closed. "Everything okay?" he asked again, this time with a hint of hesitation. I followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him. "Yes," I said simply. And for the first time, that answer did not feel like something I was saying to reassure him. It felt like something I knew for myself. He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand what had changed without being able to name it. And I realized then that he could feel it too. The difference was not in what I said. It was in what I no longer needed to say. Daniel did not stay long that evening, and I noticed how quickly the conversation ran out of direction once I stopped filling the silence for him. He walked through the house as if searching for something familiar to hold on to, but there was nothing left for him to anchor himself to. Before he left, he mentioned that the others had been meaning to come by, that everyone had just been busy, that maybe we could all get together soon. I nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just letting the words pass through without settling anywhere. After he closed the door behind him, the house returned to its quiet state, but it no longer felt like something missing. It felt complete in its stillness. The next 2 days moved with a kind of steady rhythm I had not felt in years. I woke up early, prepared my meals, organized small things around the house, not because they needed to be done, but because I chose to do them. My phone continued to light up occasionally, messages from the others coming in at different times, each one similar in tone, casual, almost careful, as if they were testing the distance between us without acknowledging it directly. I read them all. I responded when I felt it was necessary. Short. Clear. Nothing more than what the moment required. On Sunday afternoon, another car pulled into the driveway, followed by a second one just minutes later. I did not go to the window this time. I already knew who it was. The sound of doors closing, footsteps approaching, voices overlapping slightly as they moved toward the front door. The knock came quickly, followed by the faint sound of the handle being tested, a habit they had formed years ago when they never needed to wait for permission to enter. I walked to the door at my own pace and opened it, stepping aside just enough to let them in without invitation or resistance. Rebecca entered first, her expression soft but uncertain, followed by Lucas and Emily, each of them carrying that same careful energy, as if they were stepping into something unfamiliar rather than a place they had grown up in. They greeted me one by one, their voices light, their smiles practiced. I acknowledged each of them with the same calm tone I had used before, not cold, not distant, just measured. They moved into the living room, settling into familiar spaces that no longer held the same meaning. Rebecca sat on the couch, Lucas leaned against the wall, Emily stood near the window, glancing around as if trying to understand what had shifted. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but revealing. Finally, Lucas cleared his throat and mentioned that they had all been worried, that they realized they had not checked in as often as they should have. Rebecca added something about work being overwhelming, about how quickly time had passed. Emily nodded along, her voice softer, saying they should have come sooner. I listened to each of them without interrupting, without reacting, letting their explanations fill the space they had left empty for days. When they finished, all eyes turned toward me, waiting for something. A response. A release. A return to the way things used to be. I remained standing where I was, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture steady. I did not raise my voice. I did not question their reasons. Instead, I spoke in the same calm tone I had carried with me since the moment everything became clear. I told them I understood. Not because I accepted their absence as something justified, but because I no longer needed to challenge it. I told them that I had taken care of what I needed to take care of, that I was managing just fine, that there was no need for them to rearrange their lives on my account. The words settled in the room differently than anything I had ever said before. There was no request in them. No expectation. Just a statement of fact. I watched as their expressions shifted slightly, confusion mixing with something else they could not quite place. They had come expecting to step back into a role that no longer existed. And in that moment, without raising my voice or making a scene, I realized they could feel it just as clearly as I could. The space between us had changed, and there was no simple way to return to what it once was. They stayed for a while after that, longer than Daniel had, but not in the way they used to. There was no ease in their presence, no natural flow of conversation that filled the room with warmth. Instead, their words came in careful pieces, questions that circled around the same point without ever quite reaching it. Rebecca asked if I had been eating well. Lucas mentioned something about hiring someone to check in on me. Emily suggested we could set up a schedule, something more organized this time. I listened to each suggestion without interrupting, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. When they finished, I walked to the table and picked up the folder, holding it lightly in my hands before placing it down in front of them. The movement was simple, but it shifted the room in a way nothing else had. Their eyes followed the folder, curiosity replacing uncertainty for just a moment. I opened it slowly, turning a few pages with deliberate care, then stopped and looked at them. I told them that I had already made arrangements, that everything had been reviewed and updated, that I no longer needed to depend on anyone to manage what I had built over the years. My voice remained calm, measured, without accusation. I explained that the house, the accounts, everything that once felt like something to pass down had been reorganized in a way that ensured I would be taken care of on my own terms. I did not go into unnecessary detail. I did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence returned, but this time it carried a different weight. Not the emptiness from before, but the quiet realization that something had changed in a way they could not undo. Lucas was the first to respond, his voice slightly sharper now, asking what I meant by arrangements, what exactly had been changed. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression tightening, while Emily remained still, her gaze fixed on the folder. I met their questions with the same steady calm, repeating only what was necessary. That everything was handled. That there was nothing for them to worry about. That I was no longer waiting for anyone to step in. I watched as understanding slowly settled across their faces, not all at once, but piece by piece. It was not anger I saw. It was something closer to discomfort, to the recognition that the role they had assumed would always be there had quietly disappeared. For years they had moved through this house with the certainty that it would always remain as it was, that I would always be here in the same way, holding everything in place. Now, that certainty was gone. Rebecca spoke again, softer this time, asking why I had not told them sooner, why I had not asked for help instead of making decisions on my own. I listened, then answered simply. Because I had already waited. The words were not harsh. They were not meant to hurt. They were just true. No one argued after that. No one raised their voice. The conversation shifted, moving away from explanations and into something quieter, more uncertain. They stayed a little longer, speaking about small things, everyday topics that no longer carried the same weight. Eventually, one by one, they stood, gathering their things, offering brief goodbyes that felt more like acknowledgments than reassurances. I walked them to the door, watching as they stepped outside, their movements slower now, their voices lower as they spoke to each other near their cars. I did not follow. I did not call out. I simply closed the door and stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood. The house settled around me again, the familiar quiet returning without resistance. I walked back into the living room and sat down in the chair by the window, the same place where I had spent those 15 days waiting for something that never came. But this time, I was not counting days. I was not watching the street. I was not hoping for anything to change. I looked around at the space I had known for so long, and for the first time, it felt entirely mine. Not because no one else was there, but because I no longer needed them to be. I leaned back in my chair, letting the stillness settle naturally, and allowed a small, quiet breath to leave my chest. Not relief. Not sadness. Just a calm understanding that had taken me longer than I expected to reach. They had promised to take care of me. And in the end, I made sure that promise was no longer something I had to rely on.